Hey everyone, welcome to Beyond the Rhetoric. My name is Chad Hogan. You know, a common theme in these videos has been the polarization that we see in society. And I think it's always, societies have always been divisive, I think, but, it seems there's been a strong uptick in the polarization, at least in the U.S. And I think it's a huge problem, and I can't help but think about like what contributes to it, what makes it worse. And what I'd like to talk about today is postmodernism and how I think it is contributing to the problem we have with polarization. Now, postmodernism is a term thrown around a lot and very rarely defined because there's really no great definition for it. I mean, it's kind of a term used to refer to a lot of different things. But of course, there are some common tenets to it. And so I think what would be helpful is to talk a little bit about what postmodernism stands for, what are its tenets. So then I can talk about, how do those things play out in society, especially in terms of the effects of it. In fairness, I should start off by saying that, what's my position on postmodernism? So, it's always, whenever we describe something, if we were kind of for it or kind of against it, that of course is going to shape how we describe it. So I would say that I think that there are some insights, if you will, from postmodernism that are super helpful. And I think there's a lot about it that is absolute bunk. And so I'll probably end up focusing on those things I disagree with, but I certainly point out things I think are useful and important and stuff like that. So that being said, that's the caveat. Yeah, so postmodernism is really, it's kind of a reaction against assumptions of the Enlightenment era. So the Enlightenment is generally considered 1600s through the 1800s, and that's when a lot of intellectuals put their faith and their trust in reason, in the scientific method, basically saying, we can figure this out. We can figure out how to live better together, how to be more equitable, how to be more fair, and we can use our uniquely human capacities of rationality in order to do that. And, the effects of the Enlightenment were profound, but of course there were a lot of ill effects as well. And so when I say postmodernism is a reaction, basically, people were saying, a lot of bad came out. I'm not sure there's any real human progress that's inevitable from science and whatever. And then just kind of take that further and further and further. And so, in trying to get something concrete about postmodernism that I could respond to in a fairly efficient way, I went to Encyclopedia Britannica, their website, and looked up postmodernism. They said, there's 8 core tenets. And I'm like, okay, there's something concrete we can work with here. So, the main tenet that I associate with it is that the notion that there's no objective reality. So an assumption of the Enlightenment era that's responding against is that, there's an objective reality out there, and then, the job of science is to try to get to know that reality. And postmodernists say, there's no objective reality. Any reality that is there is just a mental construct that's created through scientific practice, through language, things like that. And so to start off with a bang, I think this is the stupidest damn thing ever. So one, I think there's a conflation between ontology and epistemology, right? I mean, to say that you cannot know with a certainty what reality is, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, that'll come up later in other tenets of postmodernism. I mean, that's a separate issue from, is there an objective reality? How could there not be? There has to be. Now, do we understand it? I mean, could we live in a matrix and everything that we think is reality is really just a computer simulation? Sure. And if that's the case, that's the objective reality. So there has to be an objective reality. And so to say that, we make the assumption that you can't know the reality, therefore there's no reality, is just, it doesn't hold up at all. It's a conflation. You're mixing two separate things and treating them as if they're one. There has to be an external reality. And in more practical terms, to say that there's no objective reality, I'm like, what? So if you were to step off of the roof of your house, you wouldn't fall? And if you didn't believe you would? No, of course you would. You would fall and you would really hurt yourself. That's the objective reality. Now, does the theory of gravity explain it adequately? I don't know. Probably. I think so. But if you're saying that the theory of gravity doesn't capture everything, cool. That's an epistemological problem. But anybody who says there's no objective reality, I'm like, you step in front of a car, you get hit. There's objective reality out there. I think that is just the dumbest thing ever. And then I want to come back to this a little bit because that has profound implications for polarization. But yeah, that's their big one. Now, similarly to that, they say that any kind of theory or explanations for reality can never be true. So there is no truth, first off, and what counts as knowledge is always idiosyncratic. It's always unique to the culture that created that knowledge and whatever. So I think that the value of postmodernism lies in its critique of knowledge. Like, I have no problem with that. How language is a constantly moving thing. It's not a mirror of reality. But, got it. No problem with that. So I think there's some good to be had there, especially that postmodernists tend to be very concerned with power. So basically, whoever gets to dictate what knowledge is has power. Now, the opposite, or another way of saying that, is people with knowledge have power, right? But I appreciate that. I appreciate that the power is always inherent in any social situation ever. I can't imagine a social situation where there aren't elements of power in play. And so to say that knowledge is never neutral, that it always has power, that it helps people and doesn't help others or whatever, yeah, that's good enough. But to say that there's nothing, no theories, no explanations that we ever have that could describe reality. Well, again, one thing, I think we have to start, there's an objective reality. And two, I would say, probably not. There's probably no theory that could ever be comprehensive enough to account for the complexity of reality. I got that. But to leap from there to the notion that therefore we shouldn't try, therefore all theories are just bad, much less all theories are equally inaccurate. That's a huge leap, and I don't see that as being logically connected. I don't. It's not necessarily true. Matter of fact, I think it can't be true, stated that way. So again, going back to you step off the roof of your house. We can come up with theories to try to explain that, and maybe they could never be comprehensive enough to explain for all situations and whatever. And that's postmodernism's its main gripe, is whenever you try to get a theory and make it universal, it can't be universal because knowledge is always contingent on the specific context. Sure. Gravity does probably operate differently at my house than it does on the moon. But to say that therefore no theory of gravity, just taking that as the example, is any better than any others, I'm like, no, of course they are. And it's actually not too difficult to test those things out. And that's hugely important, because if you start with they can never be true, therefore they're all equally wrong, they're all equally right, now that means that we all get to come up with our own truth. Whatever we want to believe, we get to believe. And in the physical sciences, I think it's so demonstrably false, that notion that of course we can we can demonstrate how some theories have more predictive power than other theories. Now, if you want to say that there's a difference between physical sciences and social sciences, that social phenomena, because they're not nearly as easy to predict, to describe, to come up with a theory for, I give that one a maybe. Yeah, maybe. Maybe all of our understandings of humans, of human nature, of whatever are social constructs, and they're not necessarily more true than the others. I don't know. But it also seems to me that when you come up with a theory that's so universal as to say there is no truth and there's no way to know truth, and therefore nobody should ever come up with any kind of universal theory, that seems pretty hypocritical, because what you've done is you've made an argument that there's a universal truth, and that is there is no truth and no way to find truth. And now that you've made that universal truth, you've burned the bridge behind you, and nobody else is allowed to come up with universal truth because that's what you did to say they couldn't do it. It's hypocritical in the extreme. To use reasoned arguments to make the argument that you can't use reason, and to come up with a universal truth, and the truth is there is no universal truth, it's hard to take seriously. There's a movie I saw recently that referred to postmodernism as post-war the French post-war bullshit. I think that's a great description of it. And these things are really important, because I don't think postmodernism was the beginning of relativism, of people coming up with their own truth. I think that's been happening ever since, humans were human. But what they did was they legitimized it, and especially legitimized it in academia. And that's where I think we have a lot of the problems, is if we say all of a sudden there's no way to find a truth, and so everybody's truth, it's just about fighting for truth, then it's like now we're no longer engaged in a common task of trying to find truth, right? What are universal moral imperatives, or what are good ways that we should live together? If you say, well, none of those things could ever be true, then it's like, well, how do you base everything? And that's one of the big critiques of postmodernism, is it's a moral relativism. A lot of, pure postmodern thought, if you will, extreme postmodern thought, would say that female genital mutilation in parts of the world is fine, because how are we to judge what they do when, according to their culture, that works just fine? And there's a moral relativism. It's like, yeah, we could do that. That's kind of an easy and sloppy way of going through life. What's more difficult, and I think more necessary, is for us to try to think of, what is universal, and even if there's nothing real in itself about it, even if it's a construct we come up with, what's universal? Is there something universal about human dignity that we shouldn't cause others to suffer, whatever it is, right? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an attempt to do something like that. So to say that no truth exists, no anything exists, everything is just relative to the culture it's in. Yeah, so that's what we're experiencing now in America. And if you were to say, as postmodernists do, that no truth exists, all ways of knowing are equally valid as long as that's the way of knowing of that particular community, then how can you argue against extreme white supremacist groups? I'm against them hugely. But how do you make an argument against them when the whole core of the whole basis of your argument is that it's all good? If that's your culture, that's your culture. And if you say that no truth exists and everybody does and should just fight for their own perceived interests, the interests of their group, identity politics, then again, how do you fault white supremacists, right? They're just fighting for their group, their tribe. Now, I'll argue all day long that people fighting for their own tribe is one of the big problems in the world. I'm very much against it. But postmodernism advocates, it seems to me, they want these dictums for their own side, but not for the other. They want to say all truth is equally valid so that I can put forth the truth and I don't have to adhere to the requirements that science requires of other people. I should just be able to say it because that's my truth. But you need to not say your truth because I don't like it. And that's what I think irritates people so much about it. And again, I consider myself, I'm left of center. I am not a right-wing person. But that's what people who I think lean right really get irritated about. It's like, if there's a common cause here, if we're trying to say, how do we make the world a better place? How do we make it a more equitable place? Then let's be fighting for that. But if it's just fighting for your team, then how can you fault others for fighting for their team, for their tribe? Another thing I would say, too, is this notion that reason and rationality are products of the Enlightenment, and so therefore we shouldn't use them, is also just logically flawed and is a harmful way of thinking. One, people were using reason, I think, long before the Enlightenment. I think in the Enlightenment they maybe held it up and really relied on it. They were fighting against the idea that the Catholic Church could dictate to everybody what the truth is. And they were like, no, we don't have to rely on your authority. We're going to rely on our faculties to do that. And it scares me to move away from that, because if we don't have a common epistemological basis that you and I can at least agree on some things, then we can't agree on anything. And then it's only about power. And I would say, if you're going to say that, and another critique I have of that critique is that to say that something is wrong just because you can point to what you believe its origin is, like the idea of rationality and reason, these are Western Enlightenment ideas, constructs. Well, the origin of something doesn't necessarily mean that what it is flawed or bad, right? I mean, that's like one of the common logical fallacies. Not that postmodernists would allow us to talk about logical fallacies, right? But that's one of the logical fallacies is saying, hey, this person said something, I'm going to critique the person herself or himself. Therefore, what they said was wrong. It's like, no, that has no bearing on it. What they said either stands on its own or not. And so, rationality is a tool to level a critique saying, well, it's just a product of this, is not a critique. That's just an origin story. But then I would also say, but so is democracy, right? I mean, democracy is a very Western concept. So, where do you draw the line from saying if something was developed in a certain region of the world, that's not something we should advocate for? I think I think it's just a flawed argument. So in a crude way, those are most of the basic tenets of postmodernism, and most of the, some of the faults I find with them, and some of the ways I see it playing out, contributing to a lot of the polarization. One of the biggest problems we have is a drift towards what some people have called the post-truth era, where everybody just gets to claim their own truth. And that, of course, is really, really frustrating. I think, as with anything, there's ways that it's taken to an extreme. So one way I think about it, I'll give an older example and then move to something more recent. But like, for instance, was JFK, was Kennedy shot, right? And, how did that happen? How did it go down? How was he shot? And then why was he shot? What was the reason behind it? And those are kind of three different things. So when the question of was Kennedy shot seems to be something that's pretty factual, right? Like somebody could make the argument, like, you don't know for sure, it could have been whatever. But when we get to that point where we can't agree on basic facts, basic rules of evidence, if you will. It was captured on video. There were lots of witnesses. There's a death certificate, right? I think it's hard to argue against, was he shot? Now, I can appreciate when people try to come up with, why was he shot? What's the narrative behind this? And I think that's an important distinction to make, the distinction between facts and narratives. I would probably be fairly postmodern in my skepticism towards narratives. I think any narrative would be difficult to be comprehensive enough to really capture all the specifics and all the nuances and all the interactions behind anything that happened, Kennedy assassination or otherwise. So I can appreciate that the narratives that are spun could never be complete. But that doesn't mean that all narratives are equally good or bad. But what happens in the post-truth era is when we go well beyond that, and now we have people saying he wasn't shot. And if you tell a lie often enough, especially a big lie often enough, referring to the Nazi propaganda scheme, then it just becomes accepted as truth, and that's a dangerous thing. That's a tool of propaganda. It's a tool for those with power, whether that power is official government power or just the influence that one has for whatever reason. For us to get to a point where we can't even agree on facts. I mean, in my mind, that's when I see things like that, that's when it really concerns me. It doesn't concern me as much when we argue over the narratives, right? Trying to explain the facts and how they fit together and what story that tells. I think those are not necessarily all universally the same. I think they're better and worse narratives to have, but at least I appreciate the difference. But what I see right now, my interpretation is I see a war on facts where I think, for instance, Trump was using tactics that are completely justifiable by postmodern standards. I don't think he was doing it because he's postmodern, but I just find it funny that the people on the left, including a lot of people who are postmodernists or influenced by postmodernism, can't stand it. Like, how frustrating it is to try to deal with people when you can't even agree on facts. And you're like, this is easily documented. It's like, yeah, that is frustrating, postmodernists, when you feel that you can just come up with your own truth. So I think that's one of the big problems we have right now is we have people who feel that their cause is so important that they can, just use whatever tactic is necessary, including just contest facts, come up with your own facts, do whatever you want. And now you see it right now with the with just the media and Tucker Carlson and whatever on the Capitol riots. Whereas at one point they were saying that these weren't really Trump supporters. This was Antifa in disguise, which is look at all the arrests happening. I think that's demonstrably false. And then the narrative that it wasn't a riot or an insurrection or anything; they were just tourists. Which I think the videos we have show that that's not really true. And then Tucker Carlson floated the one recently that it was actually it was an FBI plot. It's like, okay. Yeah, and there's a difference between fact and narrative, and I think we need to be more conscious of saying that there is an objective reality, so therefore there can be facts, and then we can have at least some basis for negotiating the narratives and how to explain those and what's a better or worse explanation for things. And the problem is, like I said earlier, is that postmodernism legitimized this kind of tribalistic, the truth for your tribe is truth enough, undermining of a shared epistemological basis. And that's one of the dilemmas we're in. So, curious what your thoughts are about that.